Hey everyone, the next one up on the video about the top 10 Excel functions is going to be VLOOKUP, and I think VLOOKUP is one of those functions that everyone feels a bit funny about because it looks a bit daunting, it looks a bit obscure, and people think it's difficult, but actually if you think of it slightly differently, and I'll tell you what to think of it differently, you'll find it's a lot easier than OMFG. So Microsoft's own definition of what this whole thing is a virtual lookup. You use VLOOKUP when you need to find things in a table or a range by row. So you could look up the price of a car part, or a part number, or an employee based on their ID, or someone's last name based on the first name, or a whole bunch of other things. And how to think of it in a way that you can remember it a lot better is what it says here. So VLOOKUP, what, where, and then the column number in your range. And you would almost always say false for the range lookup part. The difference between true and false is that if you set it to true, which is what it defaults to, you get an approximate match. If you set it to false, you get an exact match. So I'll show this to you in a moment, but you almost always want an exact match unless you have a good reason not. Now, your website has a lot of examples going down here, and I'm not going to show you those because if you're at the stage where you want to understand VLOOKUP, then the whole thing about is NA or year fractions and a whole bunch of other things might be a bit above your level. So I set up something much easier how to get started. Your first of the four pieces will be the value that you want to look up, or the lookup value. So if you look at my simplified ones, we have two bits of data, fruits, and random numbers with text. And the reason for this is that I wanted to demonstrate how to do lookups with something where your lookup array is numeric rather than the usual text. So we'll be doing both of those here in a moment. So as it says on the website, the first one is the value you want to look up. Then you specify your range and then the column number. Now, the thing to remember is that the value you want to look up is always in the first column of your range. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So VLOOKUP only works towards the right hand side direction. You can't do a left lookup with VLOOKUP, which means whatever you're looking at needs to be in the first column. So the way you do this is VLOOKUP and then what, which in this case is going to be A19. That's your lookup array, which is the where, and then in your case it's going to be the second column. Now, a few things to note about this setup. It's not suggested you do it precisely this way. So one thing, if you don't specify true or false, but you just end it here, you'll be fine looking at 50 for apple, and of course you won't find beef here or pies because they're not here, but because you haven't specified, so beef and pies are not in the first one. Beef is here and there are no pies at all. So where you've gone wrong. One thing is you didn't specify here that you want an exact match, so it tries to give you something that looks like beef. Now how does that happen? It starts with a B. Bananas, 60, totally wrong answer. Pies, no pies at all in neither of these, but the letter P, it would be plums, but it's not there, so it keeps going and says, oh, you know what, sod it, 40. That's one of the issues you have. If I change this to false and paste it down, you now have two NAs here because of course, as I said, no beef, no pies. But you still have a problem. If I was to write this, you would still get an NA, and you would be wondering how come that works and this doesn't. And that's because you haven't used absolute references. So if you look at this, it says A2 to B6, and you notice this is your box. Whereas here, the whole thing has moved down and apples isn't part of it. So it will be discussed further down here that you want to make sure you use absolute references for your range lookup. so you always look at the same range. Very much true. So what you want to do is that you fix these by pressing F4. So now if you copy paste it down, beef still won't work, there's no beef, but you get your second apples, because now wherever you look it's fixed fine. So there's that. For numbers, we'll be using a very similar logic, and we'll be just saying VLOOKUP that value, and this time I'll fix it, and on purpose I'll be saying you want an approximate match. Now that gives you green because actually it's a valid match, and that gives you blue because it's a valid match, but then that will give you green again because 6.2 is between these two, and so it just gives you whatever is the nearest smallest number to these in between. That might not be what you're after, so again fix this as false, and then you get an NA for 6.2 because there's no 6.2 here. What other best practices there may be? We have discussed that one. Don't store a number or date values as text. One of the things you want to know about VLOOKUP is that it tries to figure your data types based on the first few rows of your data table. And if you have mixed data types or incorrect data types, it will not understand that you're talking about dates. It will think you're talking about text, and then it will think that August comes before January because A comes before J. So don't do that. Also, you want to make sure that your first column is sorted if your range lookup is set to true, because as I said, it gives you an approximation, but it's not particularly smart. So there are ways to do binary lookups in Excel, and match is useful for that, and VLOOKUP could be useful for that, but we're not talking about that here. We're not doing binary lookups, it's an advanced method, and therefore A, don't use approximate lookups, and B, if you really have to do it, then make sure that your data is sorted properly. Now, you may or may not want to use wildcard characters. So if range lookup is set to false and lookup value is text, you can use a wildcard character such as a question mark or an asterisk in the lookup value. The question mark matches any single character, or the asterisk matches any sequence of characters. So if you think VLOOKUP Fontan, then it will give you an instance where Fontana is a valid match. It could be Fontani or Fontano. It does the job. So if you don't know for whatever reason what precisely you're looking at, however you do have a good idea about it, then you could use wildcards. Also, make sure that your data doesn't contain erroneous characters. So when you're searching for text values in the first column, make sure that the data in your first column doesn't have leading spaces, trailing spaces, and don't mix up single or double quotes or quote marks or non-printing characters, because you may or may not find what you're after. So demonstrating that, and going back here, you know how these are two apples. If I now say apple space gets an NA, because realistically this has a space and there is no such thing in here. Also, if I now say apples space, note how I have the space here, you'll get 20. So that is completely true, because apple space comes back to 20. Whether or not is the value you're after, not to you. So again, there's a lot of knowledge on Microsoft's website about VLOOKUP, or you can drop a comment to me and I'll try to explain to you whatever your question may be. Thanks for watching.